At exactly 3:45 a.m. on June 16, 2025, 30 submarine-launched Tomahawk cruise missiles, each valued at more than $2 million, erupted from beneath the icy waters of Russia's northern frontier, guided by satellite-based mapping. Systems that could not be jammed or spoofed, every missile screamed across the frozen tundra, capable of landing within 10 feet of its intended mark. And before Moscow's command structure had time to register what was happening, the United States unleashed its second hammer blow. From the deck of a 100,000-ton, $13 billion nuclear supercarrier, wave after wave of American air power surged. Skyward, electronic warfare squadrons flooded Russian airwaves with sheets of static and phantom signals, while A-1A Super Hornets dropped more than 80,000 pounds of laser-guided destruction on Russian air defense networks painstakingly built over decades. Not a single U.S. aircraft was downed, not one Russian interceptor reached its mark. The question remained, how had Washington executed such a flawless, lightning-fast global strike with virtually no warning, and what secret methods had left Russia's formidable defensive shield so porous? The answer began 24 hours earlier. Beneath a dim Norwegian sky, the massive deck of the USS Gerald R. Ford thrummed with carefully choreographed urgency. This $13 billion marvel, the most advanced warship afloat, prepared quietly for war. Ordnance crews armed $70 million A-1A Super Hornets with $400,000 HARM anti-radiation missiles and $25,000 STAM precision kits, while teams of electronic warfare specialists sifted through Russian radar frequencies in silence. Every clatter of steel, every hiss of hydraulic machinery was the sound of lethal precision taking shape. Far below the surface of the Arctic Ocean, the USS Florida moved silently through the black water. Once a Trident ballistic missile submarine, she had been converted at a cost of $700 million into one of the most lethal strike platforms in the U.S. arsenal. She carried 150 for Tomahawk Block V missiles, an entire floating arsenal worth more than $300 million. Her sonar teams listened with hunter's patience for the faintest trace of Russian patrols. In the dimly lit control room, sailors bent over glowing displays, knowing that the smallest mistake could unravel the entire operation. But brute force alone was not the true secret of the plan. The real advantage came from deception. Several hundred miles to the southwest, the carrier USS Dwight D. Eisenhower and her escorts conducted loud, obvious war games. Her massive SPY radar beams swept the horizon in wide arcs. Combat air patrols traced predictable loops in the sky. Communications were kept open, easily monitored by Russian airs. To satellites and long-range sensors, it appeared obvious the Eisenhower was the spear point. The Russians were meant to watch her, and they did. Meanwhile, the Ford and Florida kept radio silence. The Ford's billion-dollar radar systems were locked in emission control. Whisper quiet. E-to-D Hawkeye early warning planes, each worth $200 million, flew cautiously at the edge of radar shadow, passively charting Russian defenses without betraying their presence. On the Ford's deck, A-1A Growlers sat fueled and armed, rehearsing how they would blind Russia's S-400 missile batteries in a wall of electronic noise the instant the order came. Beneath the Arctic pack ice, the Florida slowed her advance to less than 5 knots, her crew deliberately reducing reactor noise and heat signature. In the torpedo room, her vertical launch tubes were loaded and ready. Each Tomahawk carried sophisticated software allowing it to skim the Earth at treetop height, hugging valleys and ridgelines like a predatory bird on autopilot. In a nearby compartment, officers leaned over paper maps of Murmansk and Severomorsk, marking strike patterns with grease pencils, simple tools immune to cyber intrusion or electronic spying. Farther south, the Eisenhower's performance achieved its purpose. Russian surveillance aircraft and long-range radars devoted their attention to the Baltic approaches, confident that the attack would come from the southwest. By the time Moscow understood that the true strike group was assembling in silence off Norway, it would be far too late to reposition its defenses. This was more than a mission. It was the Cold War reborn, its shadows sharpened by 21st century technology. It was a contest of patience, of silence, of carefully measured moves by American sailors and aviators bearing decades of hard-earned lessons. And when the silence finally broke, the world would hear it loud and clear. At 3:45 a.m. local time, the quiet under the Arctic waves was shattered. From a depth of nearly 100 feet, the USS Florida erupted in violence. One after another, 30 Tomahawk missiles burst from her vertical launch cells, each expelled by compressed gas charges that hurled them skyward like steel lances piercing the ocean's surface. In seconds, their solid fuel boosters ignited, painting the night with streaks of flame as the weapons clawed upward. The booster phase lasted only seconds, accelerating each missile past 550 miles per hour before falling away. Then the small Williams turbojet engines roared to life, carrying the Tomahawks into their low-altitude attack profiles, skimming only 100 feet above the tundra. Each warhead weighed 1,000 pounds, guided by inertial systems, GPS, and advanced terrain-matching software that compared the land below with high-resolution satellite imagery and navigation system impossible to jam, as if an unhackable version of Google Maps had been embedded in every missile. Inside the Florida's control room, sailors sat expressionless, eyes fixed on their screens as blue symbols fanned out, each icon representing a missile streaking toward Russia's Kola Peninsula. They knew that in less than 2 hours, the geography of Murmansk would be altered forever. Meanwhile, Russian coastal radar stations scanned the wrong horizons. Their early warning systems had been seduced by the Eisenhower's theatrics. The Tomahawk slipped neatly through seams in radar coverage, their signatures further obscured by jamming networks preparing to activate overhead. Only as the missiles neared their targets did Russian sensors begin to glimpse them. By then, it was hopeless. The Block V Tomahawks flew so low that they skimmed beneath many defensive engagement envelopes entirely. From the instant they were spotted to the moment of impact, defenders might have no more than 50 seconds, barely enough time to raise an alarm. At precisely 5:39 a.m. local time, the first Tomahawk struck. The target was vast, a sprawling fuel depot north of Murmansk, its tanks feeding the lifeblood of Russia's northern fleet. The first missile struck with surgical precision, and a split second later, the depot erupted. A rolling fireball tore into the morning sky, birthing a column of flames so immense it turned dawn into a false noon. Villagers 10 miles away felt its searing heat against their skin. Before the shockwave could fade, a second missile smashed into a radar command post, erasing an entire S4O control hub in an avalanche of shattered concrete and twisted steel. Then came the rest. Dozens more missiles screamed in, striking hardened ammunition bunkers, radar emplacements, and communications nodes. Some carried different orders. Bridges and access roads crumbled under their detonations, cutting off reinforcement routes. Others slammed into electrical substations, plunging entire sectors of Murmansk's defense grid into blackout. Back aboard the submarine USS Florida, her crew sat in silence, watching the results unfold on screens. Their mission for the moment was complete. In the stillness of the control room, the weight of their actions pressed down. This was not just a strike, it was a deliberate dismantling of Russia's northern defenses, executed before a single American aircraft crossed the threshold. The missiles were not simply weapons, they were keys, kicking open a door Moscow would struggle to close again. As the Arctic sun edged higher, phase 2 began. With Russia's coastal batteries crippled by the Tomahawk barrage, the USS Gerald R. Ford seized the initiative. Her flight deck roared to life as deck crews moved with clockwork precision, launching wave after wave of F/A-18 Super Hornets and EA-18G Growlers into the freezing sky. Steam catapults hissed and thundered, flinging fighters from 0 to 160 miles per hour in just over 2 seconds. Within minutes, to full squadrons clawed into the air, their wings slicing through the pale horizon. The Hornets ascended to 20,000 feet, then leveled into strike formations. Each aircraft carried a lethal mix, AGM-88 HARM missiles designed to home on enemy radars, and 2,000-pound GPS-guided JDAMs capable of striking within 10 feet of a target. Flying in tight coordination, the Growlers activated their ALQ-99 pods, spewing out torrents of electronic interference that flooded Russian radar bands. Inside Murmansk's command bunkers, operators stared at screens filled with Chaos Phantom echoes, ghost aircraft appearing and vanishing at random. Confusion was the plan, and confusion reigned. East of Severomorsk, 1S400 battery made a fatal decision. Its operators, desperate to pierce the haze, pushed their 30 and 6E to fire control radar beyond safe limits, burning hotter and brighter than intended. An orbiting Growler detected the emission instantly, feeding precise targeting data over Link 16. To nearby Hornets, rifle, came the calm call. Both jets released HARMs, accelerating to Mach 2. The missiles locked onto the radar's signal and screamed in. The Russian crew tried to shut the system down, but it was too late. Twin impacts tore through the battery, scattering fragments of launchers and radar dishes into the subarctic sky. Meanwhile, other strike groups pressed deeper inland. Using intelligence from E-D Hawkeye surveillance aircraft and their own onboard sensors, Hornet pilots picked out mobile Panzer air defense systems tucked among snow-draped ridges. From altitude, they released JDAMs with disciplined precision. The bombs glided silently before their delayed fuses triggered on impact, transforming armored vehicles into fiery craters. Above, the Growlers orchestrated their invisible campaign, blanketing air defense frequencies in static and jamming ground control channels. Russian controllers shouted into microphones, trying to vector MiG fighters into intercept, but their voices dissolved into broken static and digital ghosts. On the ground, Russian soldiers could only watch the contrails streak overhead. They were not untrained like Saddam's crews decades earlier. These men understood the cost of switching on their radars. Training and bitter experience had taught them illumination meant death, so they stayed hidden, crouched in bunkers, waiting for the storm to pass. By 0715 local time, the Hornets were turning back toward the ford. In less than an hour, they had unloaded nearly 80,000 pounds of ordnance cratering radar stations, missile sites, and supply depots from the air, the once formidable defense grid looked broken, its organized lattice now replaced by burning wreckage and splintered towers. Moscow's northern shield, battered and scarred, was no longer capable of a quick recovery. High above, contrails from departing Hornets stretched and faded into the Arctic sky, leaving behind more than destruction. They left a message written in fire. The U.S. Navy had arrived, and in under an hour, it had blown the hinges off the door, but the operation did not end there. Even as the last Hornets touched back down on the ford, the silence lasted only minutes. Russian scopes lit up again, not with aircraft this time, but with a fresh wave of incoming missiles. From beneath the shifting ice floes, the USS Florida loosed another 40 Tomahawk block the missiles in carefully timed intervals, staggering their launches by seconds to complicate interception. Each missile broke the ocean's surface, climbed briefly, then dipped low, hugging the terrain at barely 100 feet. Their guidance systems constantly compared ground contours to stored satellite maps, correcting by mere feet when needed. Dozens of low-flying shapes skimmed across frozen valleys, invisible until they were seconds from impact. Overhead, U.S. tankers like the KC-135 and KC-46 circled patiently in racetrack orbits south of the battlefield, feeding Hornets that needed extra fuel to loiter and strike again. Each pass transferred tens of thousands of pounds of JP-8 into thirsty fighters, keeping the pressure relentless. No gap was allowed for Russia to regroup. At the same time, the Growlers continued their electronic siege. Looping at medium altitude, they blanketed the spectrum with static, jamming frequencies across the board. Russian operators in bunkers and mobile command trucks stared helplessly at screens filled with nothing but snow, Voice nets dissolved into static. Command channels failed, confusion deepened. Even the highly mobile SA-15 and Panzer units, trained to reposition in seconds, were left disoriented and blinded. At exactly 7:48 local time, the first of the new generation Tomahawk cruise missiles struck. Unlike earlier strikes that targeted radar arrays or fuel reserves, this salvo carried a deadlier intent. Several warheads locked onto fortified command centers, long assumed invulnerable without a direct air raid. One Tomahawk, armed with a specialized bunker-busting payload, slammed into the side of a granite hillside. It burrowed deep before detonating, the blast reverberating through the tunnels and tearing reinforced blast doors from their frames. Another missile plowed into a vehicle staging ground, igniting ammunition stockpiles in a chain of violent eruptions that lit the sky with rolling orange fireballs. Elsewhere, two more found their mark on a critical power substation just south of Severomorsk. That single strike crippled a vital node feeding electricity to an array of radar stations. Within moments, entire swaths of the northern defense grid flickered out, leaving Russian crews screaming into headsets that now carried only silence. What made the assault devastating wasn't just advanced technology, but the flawless coordination behind it. The submarine USS Florida unleashed its Tomahawks first, dismantling fixed defenses and crippling logistics hubs, then the carrier USS Gerald R. Ford launched waves of Super Hornets to hunt down what mobile systems remained. Electronic warfare aircraft, the Growlers ensured Russian sensors were blinded, jamming what few eyes and ears still functioned. Above it all, E-2D Hawkeye command aircraft stitched every moving part into a unified picture, directing forces with second-by-second precision. By the fifth hour of continuous combat, Russia's northern shield was torn to shreds, roads were cratered beyond use, fuel depots and ammunition caches burned unchecked, and once formidable communication networks sputtered or went dark. From high altitude, whether through the eyes of Growlers, tankers, or rivet-joint surveillance planes, the battlefield resembled a land smashed by a colossal iron hammer, the frozen landscape scarred with fire and smoke, and the storm had not yet ended. By the time the last American jets turned for home, the entire expanse around Murmansk and Severomorsk resembled a torn-open wound across the Arctic frontier. Thick plumes of oily smoke spiraled thousands of feet into the atmosphere satellite, images that would circle the globe within hours. What had been hailed as the Northern Fleet's iron wall dense with radars, missile emplacements, and hardened bunkers was reduced to a gutted shell, dotted with still-burning craters under the icy wind. Out on the Barents Sea, the Gerald R. Ford rode the swells with calm authority, helicopters lifting from her deck to collect reconnaissance and retrieve spent sonobuoys. Flight crews worked with methodical focus, securing blackened Hornets, and rearming the Growlers just back from their final jamming runs. Below decks, ready rooms hummed with low-voiced conversations as pilots compared notes on explosions witnessed and targets confirmed, while maintenance crews stood ready to turn aircraft around if the fight reignited. Far beneath the waves, the USS Florida descended into deeper thermal layers where cold currents bent sonar and masked her escape from Russian hunters. Her missile tubes were spent, her mission concluded. Yet the mood aboard was not celebratory, only a solemn understanding that they had crippled Russia's northern stronghold with a blow that would echo for years. In Murmansk, the few surviving operators stumbled from bunkers, coughing through dust and smoke. They stared at shattered radar dishes, smoldering launchers, and ruined infrastructure. Communications officers still clutched radios, futilely calling for units that had gone silent long before. Screens that once tracked every contour of Arctic airspace now glowed with static, or worse, emptiness. The deepest wound was not material, but psychological. Russian commanders knew what it meant. In less than 6 hours, a single American carrier strike group paired with one stealthy submarine, had unraveled defenses built over decades. No U.S. ship had been sunk, not a single jet had been lost, not one Russian SAM system had scored a confirmed kill. They had been out-hot, outmaneuvered, and outmatched at every turn. Above the devastation, American Hawkeyes still orbited, assembling the last electronic mosaic of the battlefield. Their operators mapped dead power grids, highways choked with burning convoys, and surviving air defense crews paralyzed, afraid to risk even a radar pulse. These feeds were already streaming back across the Atlantic to Norfolk, and the Pentagon irrefutable. Evidence that American maritime power was not theory, but proven steel. By evening, the Ford and her escorts were steaming westward, disappearing into the Atlantic, leaving behind only drifting wreckage and rising columns of smoke. The battle group would vanish over the horizon, but the message would remain stark, cold, and undeniable in the 21st century. Just as in the 20th, certain lines must not be crossed. Because when tested, the United States could still strike with crushing precision. In less than a single day, its sea and air forces dismantled Russia's northern bastion, a fortress decades in the making, reduced to wreckage in mere hours. It was a lesson written in flame and steel. When America commits its carriers, submarines, and aviators, few adversaries on Earth can withstand the onslaught. For those watching around the world, the operation echoed an older era. The patience, the deception, the clinical execution hallmarks of the Cold War returned with new tools. Yet the same essence, strength, unity, and American ingenuity remained the final arbiters of peace. As the Ford slipped toward the horizon and the Florida sank into the depths, they left more than destruction behind. They left a warning in a world